History calls it the Dark Ages. But was it really an age of darkness, ignorance, and decline? Or is that just a myth, created centuries later by people who wanted to rewrite the past? Tonight, we'll uncover the hidden truths of the so-called Dark Ages, a time far more complex, creative, and vibrant than you've been led to believe. Imagine walking through a misty forest in medieval Europe. The sound of hooves echoes in the distance. A flicker of candlelight illuminates a monk's tiny cell, and a distant bell tolls from a monastery atop a hill. You might think this is a world of darkness, a time when knowledge vanished and people lived in ignorance. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about the so-called Dark Ages is wrong? Tonight, we are going to uncover the hidden truths of this period, to see that it was not a time of emptiness, but a bridge between the world of Rome and the Europe that would follow. Before we dive in, I want you to imagine yourself as someone living in the 6th or 7th century. The Roman Empire has just collapsed in the West. Cities have shrunk, central authority is gone, and the map of Europe is being redrawn by kings, warriors, and tribes. Yet, as you walk through the streets of a surviving town, you might notice craftsmen at work, children learning Latin, and monks carefully copying manuscripts. You might hear traders speaking different languages, goods moving along rivers, and travelers bringing news from distant lands. This was not a world frozen in darkness. It was alive, shifting, and adapting. The term Dark Ages itself is misleading. It was invented centuries later by Renaissance thinkers who wanted to contrast their enlightened era with the centuries after Rome's fall. They saw disorder, political fragmentation, and the decline of classical learning as evidence that humanity had sunk into ignorance. But history is rarely so simple. While Rome's political structure crumbled, much of its cultural and technological legacy survived. Roads, aqueducts, and bridges remained in use. Latin continued as the language of the church and law, and perhaps most importantly, knowledge itself was carefully preserved, often in the quiet, dimly lit halls of monasteries, away from the chaos of invading armies and shifting kingdoms. Picture an Irish monk in the 7th century. Sitting by candlelight in a stone cell, he copies an ancient Roman manuscript page by page. Every stroke of his quill is an act of devotion, but also an act of preservation. These men and women, often anonymous to history, were the guardians of human knowledge. They saved texts from Greek philosophers, Roman historians, and early Christian theologians. Without their painstaking work, much of what we know about antiquity would have been lost forever. And yet this era was not just about preservation. Innovation and adaptation were happening all around Europe. In the lands of the Franks, Saxons, and Visigoths, rulers consolidated power, reorganized territories, and maintained local law. Trade continued, even if it was more regional than imperial. Artisans, farmers, and scholars were all contributing to a world that, while different from the Rome they had inherited, was not inferior. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800, would later foster what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, reviving literacy, learning, and the arts. But even before his reign, Europe was already experiencing bursts of creativity and adaptation in agriculture, craft, and culture. Consider the practical innovations of this time. The heavy plow, capable of turning the dense northern European soil, transformed agriculture. The three-field system increased productivity, allowing communities to feed growing populations. Even in architecture, new styles emerged. Early stone, churches and fortifications began to dot the landscape, blending Roman techniques with local needs. While wars and political instability often dominate our imagination, daily life was a complex dance of survival, adaptation, and gradual progress. It is also important to note that cultural exchange continued. Trade routes connected communities, across rivers, coasts, and mountain passes. Goods, ideas, and knowledge flowed between distant lands. The Vikings, often remembered only for their raids, were also traders, explorers, and settlers who connected Europe with the Middle East and beyond. Similarly, interactions with the Islamic world brought advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and scholarship into European consciousness. Even in a time that later historians labeled dark, the world was moving, learning, and exchanging knowledge. Art, literature, and music flourished quietly. Monks illuminated manuscripts with intricate designs, creating works of breathtaking beauty. Poets composed epic tales, blending history and legend, passing down stories that would influence generations. Gregorian chants echoed through monasteries, the first hints of musical structures that would evolve into complex forms centuries later. Far from being culturally barren, these centuries laid foundations for future European creativity. So why do we still call it the Dark Ages? Part of it is bias, stories told by later writers who wanted to elevate their own time. Part of it is simplification. It is easier to draw a straight line from dark to enlightened than to explain centuries of nuanced change. And part of it is drama. The image of Europe as a continent lost in darkness captures the imagination far more than a story of resilience, adaptation, and quiet brilliance. As we explore the centuries to come, remember this: the Dark Ages were not a void. They were a time of transition, of creativity hidden behind the surface of turmoil, of knowledge preserved against the odds. They were the bridge between the world of Rome and the world that would follow, a bridge built by ordinary people whose extraordinary efforts shaped the course of history. From the monasteries of Ireland to the courts of the Frankish kings, from the villages that nurtured new agricultural techniques to the waterways that carried trade and ideas, this was a living, dynamic Europe, far from dark and full of lessons for us today. History often asks us to challenge our assumptions. What if the so-called Dark Ages were not a period to fear, but a time to understand? What if the darkness we imagine is actually a shadow cast by our own misunderstandings? In the chapters ahead, we will uncover the truth, a Europe alive with ingenuity, resilience, and a stubborn determination to survive, adapt, and flourish. The story of these centuries is not one of loss. It is a story of continuity, transformation, and the hidden brilliance that helped shape the modern world. As we leave the quiet halls of monasteries behind, let us step into the villages and towns of early medieval Europe, where life was far from stagnant. Imagine walking along a narrow dirt road, flanked by timber-framed houses and fields stretching as far as the eye can see. Smoke curls from chimneys, and the sound of hammers and saws echoes from workshops where blacksmiths, carpenters, and potters craft the tools and goods of daily life. The people who lived here were neither ignorant nor helpless. They were resourceful, resilient, and inventive in ways that would surprise many modern observers. Agriculture was the foundation of survival, and innovations in farming were quietly reshaping the landscape. The introduction of the heavy plow allowed farmers to turn the dense northern European soil with greater efficiency, unlocking lands that had previously been unusable. The three-field system, a clever rotation of crops, prevented soil exhaustion and increased yields. As a result, communities could support larger populations, which in turn fueled trade, craft, and cultural growth. Every plow stroke, every carefully sown seed, was a step toward a Europe capable of sustaining its people and rebuilding its cities. Trade was another lifeline connecting communities across the continent. Rivers served as highways, and markets thrived in towns where local goods were exchanged for distant treasures. You could find furs from Scandinavia, spices from the East, and glassware from distant regions of the Mediterranean. Even amidst political fragmentation, Merchants and travelers carried news, ideas, and technologies along these routes, creating networks that kept the continent more connected than many imagine. Far from isolation, Europe in these centuries was a web of commerce and communication, quietly thriving beneath the surface of political chaos. The political landscape itself was far from simple, but it reveals a surprising level of organization and sophistication. Kings, dukes, and local lords ruled territories with laws, taxes, and military forces. In some regions, rulers codified customs into written law, blending Roman legal traditions with local practices. Charlemagne's empire, stretching across much of Western Europe, illustrates the potential for political unity even after centuries of fragmentation. His efforts to promote literacy, standardize weights and measures, and support monastic scholarship demonstrate that the so-called Dark Ages were also a time of ambitious leadership and visionary projects. Beyond politics and trade, culture and learning quietly flourished. Manuscripts, poetry, and music were not relics of a bygone era. They were living expressions of a society still deeply connected to its intellectual heritage. In Ireland and Britain, monks continued the meticulous copying of texts, preserving works of history, philosophy, and theology. These illuminated manuscripts were not only repositories of knowledge, but also stunning works of art, blending color, pattern, and symbolism in ways that still awe modern viewers. Each page, each stroke of the quill, reflects a civilization dedicated to learning, beauty, and the preservation of human thought. Even ordinary people engaged with the past in meaningful ways. Oral tradition remained a powerful force as stories of heroes, kings, and gods were passed down through generations. These tales, part history and part legend, provided moral guidance, entertainment, and a sense of identity. Communities remembered their ancestors and celebrated their deeds, weaving the lessons of the past into the fabric of daily life. Storytelling, in its many forms, ensured that memory, culture, and wisdom were not lost even in turbulent times. Religion played a central role in shaping society, but it was far from static or monolithic. Christianity spread gradually across Europe, blending with local traditions and practices. Monks, priests, and bishops became centers of authority, not only in spiritual matters, but also in education, diplomacy, and social welfare. Churches and monasteries often served as the hubs of towns, offering charity, education, and shelter to those in need. Pilgrimages and festivals brought communities together, reinforcing a sense of shared purpose and cultural continuity. Science and technology also made subtle yet important progress. While the grand achievements of the Roman Empire might have faded, knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and engineering persisted. Monasteries cultivated herbal gardens for healing, astronomers observed celestial movements to aid navigation and agriculture, and artisans experimented with metalwork, textiles, and construction techniques. These advances, though often overshadowed by later achievements, laid the groundwork for the innovations of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Even conflict, often cited as evidence of a dark age, had its own structure and meaning. Wars were fought over territory, succession, and influence, but they also spurred innovation, organization, and diplomacy. Castles and fortifications were constructed with remarkable skill, combining Roman engineering techniques with local materials and design. Military strategies, training, and leadership developed in response to the constant pressures of defense and conquest. Through conflict, communities learned resilience, and leaders honed skills that would shape the political and social landscape for centuries to come. Perhaps most importantly, the period preserved the seeds of future cultural and intellectual flourishing. Universities, cathedrals, and urban centers would later arise from these foundations. Art, literature, and law were not born in a vacuum. They grew from centuries of adaptation, experimentation, and the quiet determination of people who refused to surrender knowledge, skill, or creativity to the uncertainties of their age. Each incremental achievement, Each preserved text and each successful harvest contributed to the building of a Europe that could thrive in later centuries. It is easy to overlook the subtle progress of these times because it was often overshadowed by political instability, war, and disease. Yet if we look closely, we find a world that is far more dynamic than the dark label implies. The monasteries were not empty ruins but centers of learning. Villages were not backward outposts, but hubs of innovation. Rulers were not aimless tyrants, but architects of continuity and governance. Far from being a period of ignorance, the centuries following Rome's fall were marked by resilience, creativity, and an unbroken connection to the knowledge of the past. As we continue to explore this era, keep in mind that history is never as simple as it seems. The Dark Ages were not a void, but a bridge. A bridge built by countless individuals whose quiet efforts sustained civilization during a time of upheaval. Their work ensured that when the Renaissance arrived, Europe had a foundation upon which to build, not a blank slate. From the fields where farmers sowed their crops to the scriptoriums where monks preserved ancient texts, every action mattered. So, as we journey deeper into this period, notice the patterns of continuity, adaptation, and ingenuity. The so-called Dark Ages may have seemed obscure to later historians, but they were illuminated by human effort, creativity, and resilience. They were a time when Europe transformed in subtle, enduring ways, preparing the continent for the growth, art, and innovation that would follow. And now, as we move forward, we will uncover even more hidden truths. Stories of trade, invention, cultural exchange, and the persistent human spirit that kept the flame of knowledge alive even in the midst of uncertainty. As we leave the villages and fields behind, let us turn our attention to the cities and urban centers that quietly survived and even thrived during this period. While the fall of the Roman Empire led many to imagine a Europe devoid of urban life, the reality was far more nuanced. Cities like Constantinople, Cordoba, and Paris remained hubs of commerce, culture, and administration, preserving not only trade networks, but also the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. In these centers, artisans honed their crafts, scholars debated ideas, and merchants negotiated deals that reached across continents. Far from being lifeless relics, cities were living organisms, adapting to changing circumstances while continuing to foster human achievement. One striking example of innovation comes from the realm of architecture. Stone bridges, fortified walls, and cathedrals began to rise across Europe, combining Roman techniques with emerging medieval styles. Each construction project required not only skilled labor, but also intricate planning, knowledge of materials, and coordination across large teams. These structures were not merely functional. They were symbols of resilience, ingenuity, and the collective ambition of communities determined to leave a lasting mark. As we walk through the remains of these buildings today, we are witnessing the persistence of knowledge, craftsmanship, and vision, quietly challenging the notion of a dark age. Education and scholarship, too, were far from dormant. Monasteries remained vital centers of learning, preserving not just religious texts, but also works on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. In Ireland and Scotland, monks meticulously copied manuscripts, creating illuminated works that combined beauty with precision. In the monasteries of France, Germany, and Italy, scholars studied natural phenomena, recorded historical events, and experimented with early scientific methods. These activities ensured that knowledge was not lost, but passed down, laying the groundwork for the intellectual flowering of later centuries. Trade and economic activity continued to connect Europe with distant regions. The Mediterranean remained a bustling network of merchants, sailors, and traders, carrying goods, ideas, and technologies from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Northern Europe, with its rivers and seas, participated in trade routes that linked Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the continental mainland. Even small towns were connected to these networks, exchanging wool, timber, metals, and other resources. Each transaction was a thread in a complex web of economic interdependence that defied the notion of stagnation. Art and culture, often overlooked in discussions of the Dark Ages, flourished in subtle and meaningful ways. Manuscripts were illuminated, with intricate designs, tapestries depicted epic stories, and metalwork displayed exceptional skill. Music, too, thrived, with melodies and chants echoing through churches and courts. Oral traditions preserved history, myth, and morality, allowing communities to retain a sense of identity and continuity. Far from being culturally barren, this period fostered creativity that would inspire generations to come. Religious and philosophical thought remained vibrant. Christianity continued to spread across Europe, adapting to local customs and beliefs. Pagan traditions lingered in folklore, festivals, and seasonal rituals, often blending with Christian practices to create unique cultural expressions. Religious leaders were not merely spiritual guides. They were also educators, diplomats, and administrators. Their influence extended into law, social welfare, and community organization, demonstrating that the spiritual and the practical were deeply intertwined. Political structures, though fragmented, were complex and adaptive. Kings and nobles negotiated alliances, managed resources, and maintained armies, often displaying remarkable strategic skill. Legal codes, inspired by Roman law but adapted to local conditions, provided frameworks for justice and governance. Even in the absence of centralized power, communities developed systems of accountability, negotiation, and dispute resolution. These mechanisms ensured social stability and continuity, challenging the stereotype of chaos and disorder. Technology advanced quietly but steadily. Agricultural tools improved, watermills multiplied, and roads and bridges facilitated movement and trade. Armorers experimented with metals, carpenters with timber, and shipbuilders with design, creating vessels capable of traversing rivers and seas. Each incremental improvement, though modest on its own, accumulated over time, equipping Europe with the practical knowledge needed for future expansion and prosperity. Warfare, often seen as the defining feature of the Dark Ages, also contributed to innovation. Siege engines, fortifications, and strategic planning became more sophisticated, reflecting a deep understanding of engineering and logistics. Knights and soldiers trained rigorously, learning skills that combined physical prowess with tactical intelligence. While conflict brought hardship, it also drove creativity, organization, and leadership, reinforcing resilience in societies that might otherwise have struggled under external pressures. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period is the persistence of human curiosity and adaptability. People did not simply survive, they adapted, experimented, and innovated. Farmers developed crop rotations, artisans refined techniques, scholars preserved knowledge, and communities maintained trade networks. Each generation built upon the achievements of the previous one, creating a continuum of progress that, while often subtle, laid the foundation for the transformative centuries ahead. As we trace these threads of continuity, it becomes clear that the Dark Ages were not a void, but a period of preparation, adaptation, and quiet accomplishment. Civilization did not vanish. It transformed, adjusting to new circumstances while retaining the core of its intellectual, cultural, and social heritage. The image of a Europe plunged into ignorance and decay is misleading. In reality, it was a continent actively negotiating change, sustaining knowledge, and nurturing the seeds of future growth. In reflecting on this era, we begin to see the interconnectedness of human effort across domains. Every plow, every manuscript, every market exchange, Every construction project and every ritual contributed to the preservation and advancement of society. Knowledge was transmitted, culture evolved, and communities remained resilient despite the challenges of political fragmentation, war, and disease. Far from being dark, this period was marked by human perseverance, creativity, and continuity. As we continue our journey, we will explore the stories of individuals, inventions, and movements that further illuminate the richness of this era. We will witness how Europe navigated adversity, maintained networks of learning, and fostered the growth of cities and culture. By the end of our exploration, it will become clear that the Dark Ages were not a time of despair, but a period of transformation. A bridge connecting the ancient world to the medieval and ultimately to the Renaissance. The next steps of this journey will take us deeper into the lives of the people who inhabited this era. We will uncover the techniques, traditions, and ingenuity that defined their daily existence, from the quiet scribes who labored in scriptoriums to the merchants who connected continents. Every act of persistence and creativity contributed to the survival and eventual flourishing of Europe. These stories reveal not just survival, but the emergence of ideas, structures, and networks that would shape centuries to come. In understanding this, we gain a new perspective on the so-called Dark Ages. It was not a time of stagnation, but of adaptation, invention, and resilience. Every village, every market, every monastery played a role in preserving the knowledge, culture, and skills that would blossom in later centuries. The true story of this period is not one of darkness, but of quiet illumination, where the human spirit continued to thrive even in challenging circumstances. As we leave behind the bustling cities and the quiet hum of scholarly monasteries, let us now turn to the broader landscape of Europe, where daily life for the majority of people was deeply intertwined with the rhythms of nature and the seasons. Contrary to popular belief, the Dark Ages were not an endless struggle against chaos and famine. Peasants, farmers, and craftsmen developed strategies, techniques, and traditions that allowed communities to thrive in ways that were sustainable, practical, and deeply connected to the land. The cultivation of crops, the breeding of livestock, and the management of natural resources required a sophisticated understanding of ecology, climate, and animal behavior, passed down through generations. These practices were far from primitive. They were the product of careful observation, experimentation, and collective wisdom. One remarkable aspect of this period was the resilience and adaptability of agricultural communities. Crop rotation systems were implemented to maintain soil fertility, combining grains, legumes, and root vegetables in patterns that sustained productivity. Tools such as the heavy plow and horse collar transformed the efficiency of farming, allowing more land to be cultivated with less labor. Watermills harnessed the energy of rivers to grind grain and process other materials, demonstrating a practical application of engineering knowledge. Villages were not isolated. They were connected through local markets, fairs, and seasonal gatherings that facilitated trade, knowledge exchange, and social cohesion. Each innovation, no matter how small, contributed to the stability and advancement of rural life. Beyond agriculture, craft and industry played an essential role in sustaining communities and building the foundations for economic growth. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and household implements. Carpenters shaped wood into homes, bridges, and ships. And potters, weavers, and leatherworkers produced goods that were both functional and artistic. The transmission of technical knowledge was not confined to texts or formal education. It occurred through apprenticeships, oral instruction, and hands-on experience. In this way, skills were preserved, refined, and adapted to meet the evolving needs of society. The ingenuity of these artisans and laborers ensured that, despite political upheavals or external threats, communities could maintain a high degree of self-sufficiency and cultural continuity. Religion and spiritual life continued. to be a driving force in shaping identity, morality, and social cohesion. Churches and monasteries were not just places of worship, they were centers of community, education, and governance. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar, offering moments of communal celebration, reflection, and renewal. Pilgrimages, shrines, and relics drew people from distant regions, reinforcing networks of communication, travel, and cultural exchange. Even as Christianity spread and consolidated, local traditions and beliefs were woven into the spiritual fabric of communities, creating a rich tapestry of practices that balanced faith with local culture. This blending of old and new beliefs allowed people to maintain a sense of continuity and belonging while adapting to changing circumstances. Trade, both local and long distance, was another key element of continuity and innovation. European merchants and travelers maintained connections with the Middle East, North Africa, and even Asia, exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies. Silk, spices, metals, and other commodities flowed along complex trade routes, linking distant societies in networks of mutual benefit. Coastal towns and river ports acted as gateways, facilitating exchange and interaction while generating wealth and cultural influence. Trade not only supported economic stability, but also exposed communities to new ideas, artistic styles, and technologies, challenging the notion that the Dark Ages were intellectually or culturally stagnant. In addition to material culture, the arts flourished in subtle yet significant ways. Manuscripts were illuminated with exquisite detail, often combining religious themes with intricate designs, floral motifs, and depictions of daily life. Music echoed through halls and churches, with melodies ranging from simple chants to more complex compositions that reflected both religious devotion and communal celebration. Storytelling, poetry, and oral history preserved the memory of events, myths, and values, ensuring that each generation retained a connection to its cultural heritage. These expressions of creativity reveal a society deeply engaged with the human experience, even in times that have been mischaracterized as dark. Science and intellectual curiosity persisted as well. Scholars studied astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy, often blending empirical observation with spiritual interpretation. Calendars were refined to align with agricultural cycles and religious festivals. Astronomical phenomena were recorded and interpreted, and medical knowledge, though rudimentary by modern standards, reflected careful observation and practical experimentation. The preservation and study of classical texts allowed for a continuity of knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance. Monks and scholars were not isolated dreamers. They were active participants in the collection, interpretation, and application of knowledge that had practical, spiritual, and cultural significance. Even political life, often portrayed as chaotic or feudal in the extreme, displayed remarkable adaptability and complexity. Local rulers, nobility, and emerging monarchs negotiated alliances, enforced laws, and managed resources with considerable skill. Legal codes were implemented to regulate behavior, resolve disputes, and protect property rights. Communities developed councils, assemblies, and courts to maintain order, mediate conflicts, and uphold social norms. While power was decentralized compared to the Roman Empire, it was not absent. Rather, it was expressed in forms that were responsive to local conditions, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of governance and social organization. Conflict, while frequent, also drove technological, organizational, and cultural advancement. Fortifications became more complex, siegecraft more strategic, and military training more disciplined. Armor, weapons, and battlefield tactics evolved in response to the challenges of warfare, reflecting innovation and ingenuity. At the same time, military leaders often played political, diplomatic, and administrative roles, blending martial skill with strategic thinking. These dynamics reveal that even the pressures of conflict contributed to growth, learning, and resilience, rather than purely destruction or decline. As we continue to explore the subtleties of this era, it becomes evident that the Dark Ages were not a single uniform experience. They were diverse, regionally varied, and marked by a constant negotiation between continuity and change. From remote villages to thriving urban centers, from monasteries to trade networks, people navigated the challenges of their time with creativity, adaptability, and determination. The period was characterized not by stagnation, but by a subtle, steady accumulation of knowledge, culture, and innovation that prepared Europe for the transformative centuries ahead. By understanding these layers of human endeavor, we gain a clearer perspective on the nature of history itself. The so-called Dark Ages were not a vacuum. They were a period of resilience, adaptation, and preparation. Each crop sown, each manuscript copied, each trade route maintained, and each structure built contributed to the survival and growth of society. Far from being a time of despair, it was a period of quiet illumination, where human ingenuity and perseverance laid the foundation for future achievements. As our journey continues, we will delve into individual stories, inventions, and innovations that further illuminate the richness of this era. From scholars who preserved the wisdom of antiquity to artisans whose creations blended utility with artistry, each contribution forms a part of the larger tapestry that defined the Middle Ages. These narratives challenge misconceptions, demonstrating that history is rarely as simple as textbooks suggest. Instead, it is a complex interplay of survival, creativity, and adaptation, where even the most modest achievements echo across centuries. Through this lens, we begin to appreciate the Dark Ages not as a period of ignorance, but as a bridge connecting the ancient world to the medieval and ultimately to the Renaissance. The human spirit, resourceful and inventive, continued to thrive, finding ways to sustain knowledge, culture, and community even under challenging circumstances. And it is in recognizing this resilience that we can truly understand the enduring legacy of this period, one that continues to shape our understanding of Europe, history, and civilization itself. As we step further into the fabric of medieval Europe, it becomes clear that the so-called Dark Ages were a period not just of survival, but of unexpected innovation and cultural blossoming. While castles, churches, and city walls might capture our imagination today, it was the ingenuity of everyday people, the farmers, merchants, artisans, and scholars, that truly defined the era. These individuals, often overlooked by history, demonstrated remarkable resilience, creativity, and adaptability, laying the groundwork for future transformation. Consider the evolution of towns and marketplaces. Far from being stagnant medieval, settlements became hubs of economic and social activity. Merchants traveled long distances to bring exotic goods, spices from the east, wool from England, and furs from the north to local markets. These exchanges were more than transactions. They were channels for knowledge, language, and cultural influence. Market squares bustled with activity as craftsmen displayed wares, storytellers entertained crowds, and travelers shared news from distant lands. Such vibrant centers not only sustained local economies, but also created networks of connection that would eventually knit together regions across Europe. Education and literacy, though often concentrated within monasteries and religious institutions, also played a surprisingly vital role. Monks and scholars preserved classical texts, copying and translating works of philosophy, science, and literature. These efforts ensured that knowledge survived periods of political upheaval and social instability. Beyond the cloisters, cathedral schools and emerging universities began to provide structured learning environments. Students engaged with mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, questioning, debating, and exploring ideas that would lay the foundation for the intellectual revival of the Renaissance. The Dark Ages, far from suppressing inquiry, fostered pockets of intense intellectual curiosity. Art and craftsmanship flourished as well, often blending functionality with intricate beauty. Illuminated manuscripts featured detailed illustrations that combined religious symbolism with depictions of everyday life. Woodwork, metalwork, and textiles displayed precision and artistic flair, showing that utility and aesthetic were intertwined. Even the construction of cathedrals demonstrated remarkable engineering skill, combining ambitious architectural vision with meticulous attention to detail. These works required collaboration, knowledge sharing, and long-term planning, revealing societies capable of complex, coordinated effort over decades or even generations. Religion remained a powerful and pervasive influence, guiding moral behavior, cultural norms, and community organization. Festivals, pilgrimages, and communal worship structured the rhythm of life. Yet the spiritual landscape was not uniform. Local customs, folk beliefs, and pre-Christian traditions often persisted, interweaving with formal religious practices. This blending of belief systems created a rich tapestry of ritual, storytelling, and symbolism that gave communities a sense of continuity and identity. Even as rulers sought to consolidate power under the church, these practices reflected the deep human need for meaning, belonging, and connection. Innovation was not limited to thought or culture. Practical technology advanced steadily throughout the period. Watermills and windmills increased efficiency in agriculture and production, while improved plows and harnesses expanded arable land. Bridges, roads, and ships facilitated trade, migration, and communication, proving that medieval engineers were adept problem solvers. Military technology too evolved in response to challenges on the battlefield, driving developments in armor, weapons, and fortifications. Far from being stagnant, these innovations illustrate a society constantly seeking ways to optimize resources, protect communities, and navigate a complex world. Communication networks, though less rapid than today, were surprisingly sophisticated. Messages traveled via couriers, heralds, and messengers, linking rulers, cities, and monasteries. Written correspondence, often beautifully penned and sealed, facilitated diplomacy, legal matters, and scholarly exchange. Even the oral tradition, through storytelling, songs, and poetry, transmitted knowledge, values, and history across generations. This multi-layered system of communication ensured that ideas, laws, and culture were preserved, adapted, and disseminated widely, contributing to societal cohesion. Conflict, often depicted as a hallmark of the Dark Ages, also had the unintended effect of fostering innovation and cultural resilience. Raids, wars, and invasions demanded organizational skill, strategic planning, and technological ingenuity. Fortifications grew more sophisticated, combining stonework, moats, and defensive designed to protect communities. Military campaigns prompted alliances, treaties, and political negotiation, revealing an intricate understanding of diplomacy and power dynamics. While violence was undeniable, it was also a driver of adaptation, innovation, and survival. Yet, perhaps most striking is the persistence of human curiosity and creativity in all forms. Astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics advanced steadily as scholars sought to understand the natural world and humanity's place within it. Even without modern instruments or laboratories, careful observation and experimentation laid the groundwork for later scientific achievements. People studied the skies to navigate, tracked seasonal patterns for agriculture, and examined natural remedies for health. Knowledge was not merely theoretical, it had practical applications that directly enhanced daily life and survival. Social organization reflected both continuity and change. Feudal structures, while hierarchical, were built upon mutual obligation and responsibility. Lords protected and supported peasants, who in turn cultivated land, paid dues, and provided service. Local councils, courts, and assemblies managed disputes, regulated commerce, and enforced community norms. While power was decentralized, governance was practical and functional, allowing societies to endure and adapt over centuries. The social fabric, while rigid in some respects, offered stability, protection, and continuity during times of uncertainty. By exploring these multifaceted aspects of life in the Dark Ages, we begin to see a society that was dynamic, resilient, and capable of remarkable achievements. It was an era where knowledge was preserved and adapted, where culture flourished quietly, and where human ingenuity transformed the challenges of the time into opportunities for growth. Far from being an age of ignorance, it was a period of preparation, innovation, and continuity that shaped the trajectory of Europe for centuries to come. As we reflect on this period, we can appreciate that history is rarely as simple as conventional narratives suggest. The Dark Ages were not a void, but a bridge, a period in which human resilience, creativity, and social cohesion maintained the continuity of civilization. From rural fields to thriving towns, from monasteries to marketplaces, the energy of everyday life ensured that Europe would not merely survive, but evolve and flourish in the centuries ahead. The accomplishments of this period, subtle and often overlooked, continue to resonate, reminding us that even in times of apparent hardship, human ingenuity and determination can endure. This understanding challenges us to reconsider our assumptions, to look beyond the surface, and to recognize the complexity, adaptability, and vitality of the past. The Dark Ages were not merely a backdrop for future glory. They were a living, breathing era of human endeavor, rich with stories of survival, creativity, and quiet brilliance. By acknowledging these truths, we gain a deeper appreciation for the continuity of knowledge, the resilience of societies, and the enduring human spirit that connects us to our ancestors. As we move deeper into the story of the so-called Dark Ages, it becomes clear that the seeds of transformation were being sown in countless, often overlooked ways. Beyond the castles and monasteries, in the fields, workshops, and homes of ordinary people, Europe was quietly evolving. The daily rhythms of life, shaped by labor, faith, and community, fostered adaptability and resilience. Families maintained agricultural cycles, tending livestock and crops with ingenuity that responded to the challenges of climate, soil, and seasons. This constant engagement with the natural world not only ensured survival, but also encouraged observational knowledge that later generations would refine into formal science. Trade, often dismissed as sporadic or limited, played a critical role in connecting regions and cultures. Merchants traversed rivers, seas, and rough roads, carrying goods that ranged from simple pottery to exotic spices and silks. Every exchange, every market encounter was an opportunity for cultural transmission. Language, artistic motifs, and practical skills moved alongside commodities. In this way, ideas flowed through medieval Europe in tandem with goods, fostering a sense of interconnectedness despite political fragmentation. Even small villages were rarely isolated. Travelers, pilgrims, and traders ensured that knowledge, stories, and innovations circulated widely. Artistic expression continued to thrive, reflecting both local traditions and broader influences. Illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly crafted in monastic scriptoria, depicted religious narratives with astonishing detail and color. Yet these works also captured aspects of daily life, fashion, and the natural world, preserving a window into the era for modern observers. Metalwork, jewelry, and textiles revealed not only skill, but a keen aesthetic sense, blending function with ornamentation. Architecture, particularly in the construction of churches and bridges, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of geometry, materials, and engineering. Each endeavor required collaboration, planning, and vision, highlighting a society capable of remarkable feats even amid uncertainty. Religion remained a central pillar, but its influence extended beyond doctrine and ritual. Churches and cathedrals served as hubs of learning, culture, and social gathering. Religious festivals marked the calendar, structuring both work and leisure. Pilgrimages, undertaken by thousands, created networks that transcended political boundaries and encouraged the exchange of ideas and practices. Folk traditions, often blending pre-Christian beliefs with Christian rituals, enriched communal life. These syncretic practices reflect a society negotiating identity, spirituality, and continuity, demonstrating adaptability and a profound need for meaning and connection. Scientific observation, though embryonic by modern standards, made steady progress. Scholars tracked celestial movements for navigation and agricultural planning, observed medicinal plants for health, and recorded weather and seasonal patterns. Monks and scribes preserved classical texts, copying works on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Though formal experimentation was rare, careful observation and recording laid the groundwork for future inquiry. Knowledge was not abstract. It served practical purposes, guiding decisions and improving daily life, illustrating a society capable of critical thought even amid hardship. The political landscape, often portrayed as chaotic or violent, also contributed to innovation. Lords, kings, and local leaders navigated complex systems of alliances, feuds, and diplomacy. Military necessity drove advancements in fortifications, strategy, and logistics, while negotiation and treaties required keen understanding of law and governance. Feudal relationships based on reciprocal obligation provided stability and continuity, even as power remained decentralized. These structures, while hierarchical, created functioning societies capable of supporting commerce, defense, and social cohesion over long periods. Education, though limited to certain classes, was a force for continuity and innovation. Cathedral schools and early universities nurtured scholars who would eventually ignite the intellectual revival of Europe. Latin, the lingua franca of scholarship, enabled communication across regions. Students engaged with philosophy, theology, mathematics, and the rudiments of natural science. Even the practical arts, such as carpentry, metalwork, and agriculture, benefited from transmitted knowledge. Education was not universal, but it preserved critical intellectual resources that ensured Europe would emerge from this era ready for transformation. Infrastructure, often overlooked in discussions of the Dark Ages, reveals both ingenuity and adaptability. Roads, bridges, and ports facilitated trade and communication. Watermills and windmills increased agricultural and industrial productivity, transforming landscapes and economies. These innovations, while practical, also demanded knowledge, coordination, and technical skill, reflecting a society continuously seeking efficiency and improvement. Technology was not static. It evolved in response to environmental challenges, economic needs, and social organization, illustrating human creativity and problem-solving. Cultural exchange, driven by trade, warfare, pilgrimage, and migration, enriched medieval society. Ideas, customs, and artistic motifs traveled across Europe, blending with local traditions. Music, poetry, and storytelling carried history and values across generations. Even in periods of conflict or instability, cultural transmission persisted, ensuring that knowledge, beliefs, and artistic expression were preserved and adapted. The Dark Ages, far from a void, were a dynamic period in which societies learned, experimented, and exchanged ideas in ways that would shape the European future. We reflect on the entirety of this era, it becomes evident that the label Dark Ages is misleading. While challenges abounded, plagues, invasions, and social upheaval, the period was also marked by resilience, ingenuity, and quiet brilliance. People navigated complex social, political, and environmental landscapes with skill and determination. They preserved and transmitted knowledge, innovated in art, technology, and infrastructure, and maintained cultural and spiritual continuity. This era was not darkness. It was a crucible in which the foundations of modern Europe were forged, often through the subtle, persistent efforts of ordinary individuals and communities. By acknowledging the richness of this period, we gain a deeper appreciation for human adaptability, creativity, and perseverance. The Dark Ages were a time of continuity and transformation, a bridge between antiquity and the Renaissance. They demonstrate that even in times of uncertainty, societies can innovate, preserve knowledge, and maintain cultural identity. The achievements of this era, though often understated, continue to resonate, revealing a Europe capable of endurance, ingenuity, and gradual but profound transformation. Understanding the Dark Ages in this light challenges our assumptions and invites us to reconsider how we interpret history. It teaches us that human societies are rarely defined by a single narrative. Rather, they are complex, dynamic, and resilient. The people of medieval Europe navigated uncertainty with creativity, faith, and determination, laying the groundwork for centuries of cultural, intellectual, and technological development. Far from a period of darkness, this era illuminates the enduring capacity of humanity to adapt, innovate, and thrive even in the face of adversity.